The tremors began 3 weeks before the first disappearances, so subtle at first that only the seismograph operators in sub-level 94 noticed the minor fluctuations in the bedrock, rhythmic pulses that occurred at precisely 17-hour intervals, each tremor lasting exactly 43 seconds. I know these numbers because I was the senior seismograph operator, had been for 12 years, and in that time I'd never seen anything like it. Natural seismic activity is chaotic, unpredictable, varying in intensity and duration based on tectonic pressures and geological instability. But these tremors were different. They were regular. They were measured. They were, I realized with growing unease, deliberate. I filed the appropriate reports with the administratum, detailed documentation describing the anomalous readings, requesting authorization to deploy deeper monitoring equipment to determine the source. The response came 3 days later. Irregularities noted. Continue standard monitoring. No additional resources allocated. Productivity quotas remain unchanged. The Emperor protects. Standard bureaucratic dismissal, the kind that tells you your concerns have been logged and ignored in equal measure. I should have pushed harder. I should have violated protocol, demanded emergency investigation, refused to continue without proper support. But I was a functionary, trained to follow procedure, to trust the system, to believe that those above me possessed greater wisdom and authority. So I continued monitoring, watching those perfect 17-hour tremors repeat endlessly, and I told myself the administratum knew best. Hive City Secundus sprawled across 300 square kilometers of industrial wasteland on a world whose original name had been lost millennia ago, replaced by the designation Manufactorum Prime 7339. The Hive housed 47 million souls across 900 vertical levels, from the noble spires where planetary governors breathed filtered air and gazed at actual sky, to the underhive depths where mutants and criminals existed in perpetual darkness, surviving on recycled waste and desperation. I lived on level 457, mid-hive territory, neither privileged nor damned, occupying a small hab unit with my wife Serena and our son Mikhail, who was 8 years old and wanted to be a tech priest when he grew up. Our existence was unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of steady mediocrity that defines the vast majority of Imperial citizens. We worked our shifts, paid our tithes, attended mandatory prayer services, and believed the propaganda that told us we were vital components of humanity's survival. The Hive was our world. Its recycled air, our atmosphere. Its artificial lighting, our sun. We'd never known anything else. We'd never imagined we needed to. The seismograph station occupied a cramped room, deep in the Hive's foundation levels, surrounded by infrastructure water mains, power conduits, waste recycling pipes, all the hidden veins that kept the Hive's body functioning. My team consisted of 3 other operators working rotating shifts, monitoring the instruments, recording data, ensuring nothing threatened the structural integrity of our massive arcology. It was tedious work, the kind where you spend 99% of your time watching readouts that show nothing interesting, waiting for the 1% when something significant occurs. The tremors changed that. They gave me something to focus on, something to puzzle over during the long night shifts when the Hive's ambient noise dropped to its lowest levels and you could almost imagine you were alone in the world. I started mapping them, creating detailed charts showing the tremor patterns, calculating their precise origin point deep beneath the Hive's foundations, approximately 14 kilometers below our lowest sublevels. Whatever was down there was big. The energy required to generate detectable tremors at that distance suggested something massive, something operating with enormous power. I shared my findings with my supervisor, a desiccated bureaucrat named Helmont who'd occupied his position for 30 years and approached all irregularities with the same tired resignation. He glanced at my charts for perhaps 10 seconds before filing them in an archive drawer. "Noted," he said. "Continue monitoring. Nothing more. Nothing less." The first disappearances were reported on level 821, deep in the industrial sectors where Manufactorum workers processed raw ore into component materials. A work crew of 17 simply vanished during the night shift. They were logged into their station at the start of shift, but when the shift supervisor conducted her standard 4-hour check, the station was empty. The machines still running, tools abandoned mid-task. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication they'd left voluntarily, just absence where presence should have been. The Arbites investigated, of course, dispatching enforcers to conduct interviews and search surrounding areas, but they found nothing conclusive. The official determination was desertion, despite the unlikelihood of 17 workers simultaneously abandoning their posts in a hive, where unauthorized movement between levels was virtually impossible. The workers' families received termination notices, their HAB units were reassigned, and the incident was filed away as resolved. But I noticed something the Arbites hadn't, or had chosen to ignore. Level 821 was directly above my calculated origin point for the tremors, positioned such that whatever existed 14 kilometers down would be almost precisely beneath that manufactorum station. I tried to report this correlation, filed an addendum to my seismographic logs, requested someone in authority make the connection. Helmont filed my report without reading it. "You monitor seismic activity," he told me, his voice flat with bureaucratic certainty. "Missing workers are Arbites' concern. Stay in your jurisdiction." And I did. Because that's what functionaries do. We stay in our jurisdiction. We follow procedure. We trust the system to connect the pieces we're individually monitoring. We never imagine the system might be blind, or worse, deliberately looking away. More disappearances followed over the next 10 days. A crew on level 793, a residential block on level 668, a prayer gathering on level 745. The pattern was clear to me now, undeniable. Every disappearance occurred in locations directly above the tremor origin point, as if something below was reaching upward, selectively harvesting people from specific positions. The tremors themselves were changing too, becoming more frequent, their 17-hour intervals shortening to 16 hours, then 15, then 14, and they were stronger now, enough that residents on the lower levels were beginning to notice, to file complaints about vibrations disrupting their sleep or causing minor structural damage. The administratum's response was predictable. They issued a statement attributing the tremors to routine geological adjustment within acceptable parameters, and warned citizens against spreading rumors and speculation that undermine hive morale and productivity. The state disappearances were dismissed as unrelated incidents, criminal activity, or voluntary desertion, nothing suggesting coordinated threat or systemic danger. Official doctrine held that everything was normal, controlled, proceeding according to the Emperor's design, and most citizens believed it because believing was easier than questioning, because the alternative was acknowledging that something was fundamentally wrong with our world, and that acknowledgement would require action, response, change things. The Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery was singularly ill-equipped to provide. I stopped sleeping properly around the 3rd week. Serena noticed. Of course she'd wake to find me standing at our HAB unit's single window, staring out at the hive's endless levels stretching above and below, the lights that never quite went dark, the constant motion of a city that never rested. "You're obsessing," she told me, her voice mixing concern with irritation. "The administratum has investigators. The Arbites have enforcers. It's not your responsibility to solve mysteries beyond your station." She was right. Technically, I was a seismograph operator, not a detective, not a savant, not someone whose opinion mattered in the vast machinery of imperial governance. But I couldn't stop thinking about those disappearances, about the people who'd simply ceased to exist, about their families who'd been told it was desertion or criminality, who'd been required to accept that explanation without question. I couldn't stop correlating the timing of disappearances with tremor intensification. Couldn't stop calculating that at the current rate of change, the tremors would reach surface levels within 40 days. Couldn't stop imagining what might happen when whatever existed 14 kilometers down finally reached our inhabited spaces. I tried explaining this to Serena, showed her my charts and calculations, but she just shook her head. "You're seeing patterns that aren't there," she said. "You're letting fear create connections from coincidence." Trust the authorities. Trust the Emperor. We're protected. And I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the system was handling this, that my concerns were paranoid overreaction born from too much isolation in that seismograph station. But I'd seen the data. I'd tracked the progression. And data doesn't lie, even when everyone interpreting it chooses to. The breakthrough came accidentally, during a routine maintenance check on our oldest seismograph unit, a piece of equipment dating back over a century that we kept operational because Mechanicus doctrine demanded preservation of ancient machines, even when newer models existed. I was replacing a worn component when I noticed something odd. The old unit was receiving signals the newer equipment wasn't detecting. Frequencies outside the standard monitoring range, pulses occurring at intervals the modern systems were calibrated to ignore. I adjusted the settings, expanded the detection range, and suddenly my instruments were alive with activity. The tremors weren't isolated pulses, they were part of a vast communication network, thousands of signals flowing between the deep source and dozens of points scattered throughout the Hive's foundation. It was like watching a nervous system activate, neurons firing, synapses connecting, a distributed intelligence coordinating itself across the bedrock beneath our city. I recorded everything, compiled the data into a comprehensive report with visual representations and technical analysis, and I walked past Helmont's office directly to the Administratum's Emergency Response Division, demanded to speak with someone in actual authority, refused to leave until they acknowledged my findings. They made me wait 6 hours in a sterile anteroom before a mid-level administrator finally agreed to review my report. He read it carefully, asked several pointed questions demonstrating he understood the implications, and then he told me something I'll never forget. This information is classified above your clearance level. You are to cease all investigation immediately, destroy your compiled data, and return to standard monitoring duties. This directive is non-negotiable. Compliance is mandatory. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment and citizenship. The Emperor protects. He stamped my report with a seal I didn't recognize and placed it in a locked case. I never saw it again. They were already aware. That's what I realized walking back through the Hive's crowded transit levels, surrounded by millions of citizens who continued their lives in complete ignorance of what stirred beneath them. The Administratum, the Arbeits, probably the planetary governor himself. They knew something existed below the Hive, had known for weeks or months or longer, and they deliberately chosen not to inform the population, not to evacuate, not to request Imperial Guard intervention or Navy bombardment, or any of the emergency protocols that existed for existential threats. They were letting it happen, not through incompetence or negligence, but through calculated decision, cold cost-benefit analysis that had determined 47 million lives in Hive City Secundus were acceptable losses compared to whatever alternative response would cost. I felt something break inside me then. Some fundamental faith in the system that had defined my entire existence. I'd believed the Imperium protected its citizens, that the Emperor's infinite wisdom guided humanity toward survival, that the massive bureaucratic apparatus existed to serve and preserve human life. But standing there in that transit hub, watching families and workers and children flow past me in their daily routines, all of them doomed by decisions made in offices they'd never enter by officials who'd never speak their names, I understood the truth. We weren't being protected. We were being managed. And management had determined we were expendable. I should have warned them. I should have stood in the central plaza and screamed the truth until the Arbeits dragged me away. I should have sacrificed myself to give them even a chance to flee, to evacuate, to survive. But I was a coward. I returned to my HAB unit, held Serena and Mikhail, and said nothing. What could I say? That something massive and ancient stirred beneath our Hive, that it was systematically harvesting our population, that the authorities were aware and deliberately inactive, that we were probably all going to die. They wouldn't have believed me. No one would have believed me. And even if they did, where would they go? The Hive was our world. Beyond it stretched toxic wasteland, industrial zones. Other Hives equally vulnerable. There was no safe harbor, no escape. Just the slow realization that safety had always been illusion, that the Imperium's protection extended only as far as our utility, that faith and loyalty and service meant nothing when balanced against operational convenience and resource calculation. The tremors reached surface intensity on the 37th day, 3 days ahead of my projections. I was at the seismograph station when it happened, watching the instruments spike beyond their calibrated limits, needles slamming against stops, paper readouts tearing from the violence of the readings. The sound was incredible, a deep vibration that rattled machinery and cracked concrete, that made your organs resonate and your vision blur, that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. Alarms wailed throughout the lower levels. Emergency lighting activated, voxcasters crackled with damage reports, and evacuation orders that were far too late, far too inadequate, and beneath it all, beneath the mechanical chaos and human panic, I heard something else, a sound like vast mechanisms engaging, like ancient gears that had rested for millennia suddenly grinding into motion, like metal against metal on a scale that dwarfed human engineering. I knew what it was immediately, recognized it from the sealed texts I'd glimpsed during my desperate research, from the forbidden data files that existed in the Administratum's deepest archives. It was the sound of a Xenos tomb awakening, of technology so advanced it seemed like sorcery, of machines that predated humanity's rise and would outlast our extinction. The floor split open in Sector 47 Delta, level 723, approximately 2 kilometers from my seismograph station. Witnesses, the few who survived to give testimony, described it as surgical, precise, the ferrocrete and plasteel simply separating along perfectly straight lines, peeling back like flesh from a wound, revealing darkness beneath that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Things emerged from that darkness. I never saw them directly, was spared that horror through sheer accident of location. But the picked captures survived. Grainy images recorded by security servitors before they were destroyed. Skeletal figures in black metal, glowing with sickly green luminescence, moving with mechanical precision and impossible speed. Some carried weapons that stripped flesh from bone with emerald beams, left nothing but molecular shadows where human beings had stood. Others extended strange devices that seemed to capture people intact, dissolving them into light streams that flowed back into the darkness below. They didn't kill indiscriminately, that was the detail that broke most people who studied the footage. They chose specific individuals based on criteria no one understood, harvesting them with methodical efficiency while ignoring others who stood mere meters away. It was slaughter, yes, but purposeful slaughter, calculated harvest, like farmers selecting specific crops while leaving others to mature. The Vox network collapsed within the first hour as the Xenos attackers systematically destroyed communication nodes, severing the Hive's nervous system, isolating each level into its own private nightmare. I lost contact with Serena and Mikhail. They were home on level 457, hopefully safe, possibly already dead or taken. I couldn't reach them. I couldn't help them. I could only monitor my instruments as they tracked the Xenos incursion spreading through the Hive's infrastructure like infection through tissue, could only watch the readouts showing dozens of breach points opening across multiple levels, as whatever massive structure existed beneath us continued rising, pushing upward through 14 kilometers of rock and construction with irresistible force. The math was clear. At current rate of ascent, the tomb structure would reach inhabited levels across 80% of the Hive within 16 hours. 47 million people. 16 hours. And the Administratum's response was silence. Official channels dead or deliberately shut down. No evacuation orders. No military response. Just that terrible absence of authority that told you the authorities had already fled, had saved themselves, and abandoned everyone else. I sealed myself in the seismograph station, locked the reinforced door, and I kept recording. It was all I knew how to do, all I could do. My instruments tracked the tomb's emergence with perfect precision, documented every phase of the ascent, captured data that would probably never be reviewed by anyone because there would be no one left to review it. But I recorded anyway, maintained my duty, followed my training even as the world ended around me. The tremors had stopped now, not because the movement had ceased, but because the movement had become constant, The tomb structure no longer pulsing but flowing upward in continuous ascent, pushing aside or incorporating or simply erasing everything in its path. I could hear the destruction through the station's thick walls, the sound of collapsing infrastructure and screaming humanity, and those terrible emerald weapons reducing matter to component atoms. I could feel the temperature dropping as something impossibly cold rose from deep earth. Could taste metal in the recycled air. Could see my breath misting in air that had been climate-controlled hours earlier. The door held for 4 hours before they came for me. I heard them in the corridor outside, heard that precise mechanical movement, heard sounds like whispered numbers in languages that predated human speech. The lock failed with a sound like shattering glass, and the door simply ceased to exist. Its molecular bonds dissolved, and I finally saw them directly. 3 skeletal warriors in bodies of living metal, crowned with strange headdresses, their eye sockets blazing with that sickly green luminescence. Their weapons held with casual readiness. They regarded me with what might have been curiosity or contempt or nothing at all. Reading emotion in faces that were metal death masks was impossible. One of them extended a device toward me, something that looked like a scarab constructed from shifting geometric patterns, and I felt, scanning. That's the only word that fits. I felt my body being analyzed at atomic level, my genetics being read, my value being assessed according to criteria I couldn't comprehend. The scarab device pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then the warrior lowered it. They didn't kill me. They didn't take me. They simply stood there, blocking my exit, observing me like scientists observing an insect, waiting for something. The revelation came when the tomb itself breached into my level, when the floor dissolved, and that impossible darkness flowed upward. When I finally understood what existed beneath Hive City Secundus, a necropolis, a city of the dead built millennia before humanity had crawled from old Earth's gravity well, before the Imperium existed, before the Emperor walked among mortals. It stretched below me. I could see it now through the dissolved floor, could see vast galleries and crypts and structures that hurt to perceive because they existed in geometries human consciousness wasn't designed to process. And it was waking, not just this small part that had destroyed my hive, but the whole thing. Hundreds of kilometers of ancient construction stirring back to life, reclaiming territory it had occupied before humans arrived, before we'd built our city on what we thought was empty ground. We'd been living above a tomb. We'd built our homes and factories and temples on their graves, and now they were reclaiming their property, removing the infestation, clearing the obstruction we represented. I saw others then. Humans like me who'd been selected, who'd been spared immediate death for reasons I was beginning to understand. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, gathered in a vast chamber below my station, standing motionless in perfect ranks, their eyes distant and empty, their bodies marked with glowing glyphs that pulsed in rhythm with the tomb's ambient light. They weren't dead. I could see them breathing. I could see their eyes tracking movement. But they weren't alive in any meaningful sense either. They'd been changed, modified, their neural patterns rewritten, their consciousness subordinated to something vast and alien, and utterly uncaring. They were slaves now. Servitor analogues, biological components incorporated into the necropolis's systems, because even immortal machine creatures apparently found uses for living tissue. That was my future, I realized. That's why they hadn't killed me. I possessed useful skills, technical knowledge, capabilities they could exploit. I would become another component, another tool, another slave serving masters who'd died millions of years ago and been reborn in metal bodies that knew neither mercy nor compassion. The warrior who'd scanned me reached out then, its metal fingers impossibly cold against my face, and I felt something enter my mind, not pain, but alteration. Consciousness being rewritten at fundamental levels, personality being eroded like coastline under endless waves. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to myself, to remember Serena and Mikhail, to preserve some core identity that made me human, but resistance was meaningless. You can't resist when the thing rewriting you controls the very neurons firing your resistance. You can't fight when your weapons are the thing being conquered. I felt myself slipping, felt my memories becoming distant and strange, felt my sense of self dissolving into something larger and colder and perfectly logical. I understood now why the administratum hadn't evacuated, why they'd let this happen. They'd tried before, on other worlds, and it had never worked. You can't evacuate fast enough, you can't run far enough. When a Necron Tomb wakes beneath your city, the city ends, the people end, everything ends. And the Imperium, vast and pragmatic and utterly cold, had calculated that attempting hopeless rescue would waste resources better deployed elsewhere, that 47 million deaths were acceptable when weighed against the broader requirements of human survival, that we were simply casualties of living on ground that had never really been ours. My final coherent thought, before the alteration completed, before I became whatever they needed me to be, was this. The Imperium teaches us to fear Xenos, to hate them as fundamental threats to humanity's survival. But the real horror of Xenos isn't their difference, it's their indifference. The Necrons didn't hate us. They didn't even really notice us beyond our utility or obstruction. We were nothing to them, less than nothing. Temporary inconvenience on property they'd occupied since before our species developed language. They woke, they cleared their domain, they reclaimed their necropolis, and they converted whatever useful biological material they encountered. It was efficient. It was logical. It was exactly what the Imperium would do if positions were reversed. The nightmare isn't that monsters exist. The nightmare is that they're just like us. Just more efficient, just operating on longer time frames, just following the same cold logic of survival and resource management that defines all civilizations regardless of biology or history or consciousness. I serve now. I don't remember my name, though sometimes something that might be memory flickers when I pass through sections that used to be my hive, when I step over rubble that used to be someone's home, when I process the biomass that used to be 47 million individual human beings with hopes and fears and families. I serve because I have no choice, because choice is luxury for beings with intact consciousness, because I am component now, tool, property of something vast and ancient and utterly beyond my ability to comprehend or resist. Sometimes, in the microseconds between tasks, I experience something that might be grief or might just be corrupted data, residual ghost signals from neural pathways that used to generate emotion. I think about Serena and Mikhail. I think about whether they died quickly or were converted like me, whether they're working somewhere else in this necropolis, whether we pass each other sometimes without recognition. I think about the other hives on this world, the other cities that sit unknowing above other tombs, the billions of citizens who continue their lives in ignorance of what sleeps beneath them. I think about how many tombs exist across the galaxy, how many worlds humanity has claimed that really belong to beings who predate our species, how many cities are built on graves that aren't truly graves because the occupants aren't truly dead. The necropolis continues expanding, continues rising, continues reclaiming territory it considers its own. The Imperium will respond eventually, will send fleets and armies to fight for this world, will sacrifice millions more trying to hold ground they don't understand they've already lost. They'll call it heroic defense against Xenos threat. They'll praise the martyrs who die in futile combat. They'll file reports documenting the engagement, calculating acceptable casualty rates, determining whether continued defense serves the Imperium's broader strategic interests. And when the math doesn't favor them, when the casualties exceed the world's productive value, they'll withdraw. They'll abandon this world like they abandoned Hive City Secundus, like they abandon any asset that becomes liability, and they'll file it away in some vast archive as lost to Xenos aggression. And they'll move on because the Imperium survives not through caring about individual worlds or cities or people, but through cold calculation of utility and expendability. This is the terrifying reality of a Necron Tomb waking beneath your city. You die. Or worse, you continue existing in altered form, serving masters who care nothing for your previous existence, performing functions you no longer understand for purposes beyond your comprehension. Your city becomes their necropolis, your home becomes their property, your life becomes their resource, And the Imperium that promised to protect you, that you served faithfully, that you believed in absolutely, calculates your loss into its strategic assessments and continues functioning without pause, without grief, without acknowledgement that you ever mattered beyond your productive capacity. The nightmare is universal, applies equally to Xenos and Imperium. You are expendable. Your suffering is irrelevant. Your death is administrative notation, and the vast machinery of civilization, whether human or ancient machine creature, grinds forward eternal and uncaring, consuming lives as fuel, reducing individuals to statistics, transforming tragedy into acceptable operational parameters. I serve. I will always serve. The person I was is gone, erased as thoroughly as my hive, replaced by function and purpose and the cold logic of beings who measure time in millions of years and view individual lifespans as less than eye blinks. This is my ending and my eternity, my punishment for living on ground that wasn't mine, my reward for faithful service to an Imperium that viewed me as component rather than citizen. The tomb continues rising. Other tombs are waking across the sector, across the segmentum, across the galaxy. And humanity continues building on ancient graves, continues claiming territory that belongs to those who predate us, continues serving an Imperium that will sacrifice any number of them when calculation demands. The Emperor protects. We were taught, but protection is conditional, limited, subject to resource availability and strategic priority. And when you live above a waking tomb, when the ancient dead rise to reclaim their domain, when you finally understand how vast the universe is and how small you are within it, you learn that protection was always illusion. Safety was always temporary, and the only certainty is that something older, stronger, and colder than you will eventually decide you're in its way. The tremors continue, different tremors now, marking the necropolis's expansion rather than its awakening, but tremors nonetheless. Somewhere above, in hives that haven't fallen yet, seismograph operators are monitoring their instruments, filing reports that will be ignored, trying to warn populations that won't believe them. I remember being one of them. I remember thinking understanding mattered, that data meant something, that truth would protect me. But truth is just information, powerless without action, and action requires authority. And authority serves systems rather than individuals. The system determined Hive City Secundus was expendable. The system was correct. From its perspective. From its cold calculation of costs and benefits. The system survives. The system continues. And we who served it, who believed in it, who gave our lives to maintain it, we become statistics, notation, acceptable losses in the endless arithmetic of empire. This is what I remember. This is what I can't forget, even with consciousness rewritten and identity erased. This is my testimony, recorded in whatever fragments of neural tissue still fire recognizably human patterns. Preserved not through hope of rescue, but simply because recording is what I was trained to do, what I always did, what remains when everything else has been taken. If you're reading this somehow, if some part of my consciousness survived to transmit, or if these thoughts somehow became accessible to those still human, know this: the ground beneath your city is not solid, the foundations you trust are illusions, the safety you feel is temporary. And, somewhere below, perhaps kilometers below, perhaps further, something ancient waits. Maybe it sleeps forever. Maybe you'll live your life and die naturally and never know what exists beneath your feet. Or maybe, one day, the tremors will begin. 17-hour intervals. Exactly 43 seconds duration. Perfectly regular, perfectly measured, perfectly deliberate. And you'll have approximately 37 days to make your peace with the Emperor, to say goodbye to those you love, to accept that everything you believed about protection and duty and the Imperium's care was comfortable lie told to make service bearable. The necropolis grows. I serve. The tremors continue, and somewhere, right now, another seismograph operator on another world is noticing irregular readings, filing reports that will be ignored, trying to warn people who can't be saved. The cycle continues. The tombs wake. The cities fall. The Imperium calculates and determines the losses acceptable, and we who serve, who suffer, who are sacrificed, we exist in the arithmetic as numbers rather than names, as resources rather than lives, as expendable components in machinery so vast that our extinction or survival matters only in how it affects operational efficiency. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, only service, only the cold certainty that something ancient and terrible sleeps beneath every false foundation, waiting for its time to wake,